Well, it's good to be back with you. I trust your brains are full, but that I can squeeze a little bit more in. So thank you for hanging with us all and being patient and so eager to learn from so many speakers on a variety of topics. Singing that song of Luther's, that famous song, reminded me of a feeling that I had as John and I wrote the book, Scribes and Scriptures. And as we started the book, and for most of the process of writing it, I can remember feeling like I was writing a book about the history of the Bible, that I was sort of like trying to watch a river flow by, and I was standing on the banks of the river, and I was trying to document in the book the course that river took. How did the Bible get from hand-copied Hebrew and Greek manuscripts to, in my case, our English Bible, or in your case, the Dutch Bible, as it may be. And I remember having a distinct feeling by the end of the book that no longer was I standing at the side of the river watching it go by, but I was actually in the river itself. Because what I realized in writing the book is that we are not outside of the process of handing on the Bible from the generations before us to the generations that follow us. We're not outside that process. We are in that process. And one of the things I'd like to commend to you as I start my talk this morning is for you to think of yourself in that way. You may never be a Bible translator, although Paulus, I think, would love to have you sign up. But you may not be a Bible translator. You may never learn Greek or Hebrew, although, again, some of us in the room would love to teach you Greek and Hebrew, wouldn't we? But you have a part to play in handing the Bible that you have received on to the next generation. And all of us have that task as Christians, to take the Bible that's been given to us, that's been entrusted to us, and pass it along to the next generation. So even as we think now in this next talk about the question of the Apocryphal Gospels, I want you to start by thinking that way. What are you doing as part of that process to hand on the Word of God to next generation so that they can hear God speak clearly through it as well? Well, my subject for this talk is the question of the Apocryphal Gospels. Some of you, that term may be new to you. Some of you may have heard that term. Some of you may have heard of some of these Apocryphal Gospels. Like a number of years ago, there was lots of publicity about the Gospel of Judas. You may remember when that was published about 10 or so years ago. You've maybe heard of the Gospel of Thomas. Others may have no idea what any of those things are, and this is the first time you're ever hearing them. So I'm going to do my best in this talk to try to help all of us, whether you're new to the Apocryphal Gospels or whether you have some familiarity with them, to understand what they are, why they were written, why they were read, and why they are rightly not in our Bible. And in some ways, it's a fitting talk to follow Hank's talk, because in some ways, there may be no better place to start in thinking about Scripture's self-authentication. Or what was your translation, Hank? Self-convincing. Self-convincing, I like that. Self-convincing. Because in one sense, when you think about the Apocryphal Gospels, people often want to know, well, why weren't they put in the Bible? And was it a conspiracy that they were left out? And the simplest way to answer that question, especially for Christians, is just to have you read them. So what I really should do at this talk is just say, let's close in prayer right now. Okay? Go out and get a copy of the Apocryphal Gospels or look them up online and read them. I promise that self-attestation of the canonical Gospels will be very apparent by the time you are done reading the Apocryphal Gospels. You only need to read them and you will immediately recognize why they are not in the Bible. But since Derek has flown me all the way across the ocean, I probably should not end there. So I'll give you a whole talk on the Gospels. But really, you could just go read them on your own and you'll have an answer to the question, why are they not in the Bible? But to begin with, let's think about the number of Gospels. Again, for some of you, this may be the first time you're even hearing that there are other Gospels besides Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But of course, the canonical Gospels, the Gospels in our Bible, at least one of them actually tells us there are other Gospels. So the Bible itself admits there are other Gospels. When Luke begins his account of the story of Jesus, he says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Notice verse 4. I don't want to skip over it, though it's not our concern this morning. But he gives his reason for writing. I always tell my students, when a biblical author tells you why they've written, you should really pay attention to that. Why has Luke chosen to write? Verse 4, so that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. He trusts that his audience already knows the story of Jesus and has already been taught about him, but he wants to give them certainty of those things. But there's that key word in verse 1. Many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. Unfortunately, it's hard to tell from Luke's Greek whether this compiling of a narrative refers to oral versions of the gospel, the story of Jesus told orally before it had been written down, or whether he means written gospels. It's hard to tell. Of course, depending on your solution to the synoptic problem, you could argue that Luke has used both Mark and Matthew, and if he thinks two is many, then he could be the third, but it's hard to know and be sure. So we'll leave it at that and just say, Luke itself, one of our own gospels in the Bible, recognizes that other people have told the story of Jesus as well. Which brings us to the question of how many gospels are there really, or how many should there be? Famously, Origen, writing, I believe, here early in the 3rd century, says the church has 4 gospels. The heretics have very many. That's pretty simple, isn't it? Pretty straightforward. This is in his sermons on Luke's gospel, in fact, as he begins. And he was not alone. The same sentiment was expressed by Irenaeus in Gaul, so in France. It was expressed by Tertullian in modern Tunisia, by Clement of Alexandria in Egypt, and is reflected in the Moratorian fragment, which may date from the 2nd century. I'll let Dr. Mead sort that out for you. So it's geographically widespread. Already in the 2nd century, Christians are saying there's 4 gospels and only 4. And notice it's both of those things. Not more, not 5, not 3, not 2, not 1. There's 4 and only 4. Irenaeus goes so far as to say it is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. And some of you may know he goes on to give some reasons which, at least at first blush, seem a bit unconvincing. He argues that there are 4 winds and 4 pillars of the earth. And you might think, well, okay, but, we learned yesterday there's heaven, earth, and under the earth. So there's 3 things, so why not 3? But what Irenaeus is trying to say is there's a fittingness to there being 4. And it's like the fittingness of the way creation is made. And you may think, again, you can divide the world up in many ways, but we still have 4 points of a compass, don't we? We still think of north, south, east, and west. And what Irenaeus is getting at is he's saying it's very fitting. This is proper and right. It's just like the structure of the universe. Just like the structure of the universe, God has made it so that it all fits and works together. The same is true of our 4 Gospels. We need this many, no more, no less. But despite this geographically wide agreement on the 4 canonical Gospels by the mid to late 2nd century and on in the 3rd, as I said, it does not mean the 4 Gospels were all there were. We just saw from Origen, his comment, that the church has 4 Gospels, and one of the defining characteristics of the heretics is they have lots more. And so today, these other Gospels are usually referred to as the Apocryphal Gospels. We'll come back to that term in a second. And you can find a copy of them in any bookshop. You can find them online, of course. You can read most of them online for free. And they tend to be especially popular today. And they are often cited as proof for the argument that what we know of as the Bible today is really just a product of chance and not the result of God's providence. So skeptics will often love to go to the Apocryphal Gospels and say, look, this is evidence that the Bible as you know it is really just the product of chance. The right people happen to, their opinion won out. And depending on the person saying it, they may appeal to Constantine incorrectly or to the Council of Nicaea, again, incorrectly. But oftentimes the Apocryphal Gospels are appealed to as evidence to suggest that the Bible is really just a circumstance of chance, that it's an accident, and that it cannot be divinely inspired then. And among scholars, there's a push among some to see that any special treatment of the 4 Gospels is nothing more than theological prejudice. So I give as an example Helmut Kester, who taught for many years at Harvard Divinity School, in his book on ancient Christian Gospels, puts it this way. He says, only dogmatic prejudice can assert that the canonical Gospels have an exclusive claim to apostolic origin and thus to historical priority. Now what he's saying, if I can interpret it just a little bit and put it in simpler terms, what he's saying is to treat the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as different really is just prejudice. And he obviously does not mean that word positively, right? That it's just a bias. And what's interesting here is what I do want to credit him for is he does recognize a key element, and we'll come back to this. But you'll notice he says only dogmatic prejudice can say that the canonical Gospels have an exclusive claim to apostolic origin and thus historical priority. What I want to convince you of by the end of this talk is that in fact it is the apostolic origin of the canonical Gospels that does set them apart. And the early church was very unanimous in arguing this. They knew about the Apocryphal Gospels, as we'll see. They were not naive to their existence. Sometimes you may get the sense that we've only discovered the Apocryphal Gospels today, and that's true in some cases like the Gospel of Judas, but you can read about the Gospel of Judas in the church fathers. They knew about the Gospel of Jesus and had read them. At one point, Origen, just after he says the heretics have many Gospels, he essentially goes on to say, and I've read them, because I want to make sure that I don't sort of get taken in by somebody who says, well, you haven't even read the Apocryphal Gospels, right? He essentially says, no, I've done my homework. I've read these things, right? So early Christians knew about these Apocryphal Gospels. They were not sort of secret or hidden from them. But I do want to credit Helmut Kester for recognizing a crucial issue. I think the crucial issue for us is, do the four Gospels in our Bible come with apostolic authority or not? And then we could ask the same question of the Apocryphal Gospels. Do they have apostolic authority or not? All right, and I think that's the key dividing line. Now, as I did yesterday, let me remind you that these kind of academic discussions do not stay always in the academy. They filter down, and so we've been picking on the Da Vinci Code, so let me continue that theme for us. Here's a character in the Da Vinci Code, the kind of scholarly figure, Lee Teabing, who says at one point to another character, he's telling how the Bible did not fall out of heaven, which is true, I agree with him on that, but then goes on to say it's just a product of man. He says more than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament, and yet only a relative few were chosen for inclusion, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John among them. Now, in the movie, Ian McKellen plays this character. I find it hard to disagree with Ian McKellen, but I have to here. There were not 80 Gospels that were considered for the New Testament, as we'll see, but this goes right along with the kind of popular conception. Sort of like we saw yesterday with the text of the New Testament. There's kind of the academic discussion that can happen, but then when it comes down and drips down to the popular level, it often works out in ideas like this. There must have been all these Gospels, and they were all considered, and it was sort of just, happenstance that these four got chosen. There's nothing really distinctive about our four, and I want to suggest to you that's not the case at all. But before we go further, let's stop and pause and try to define what we're talking about. Because again, some of you, this whole subject may be fairly new to you if you've not read them or you're hearing the term for the first time. What are the Apocryphal Gospels? First of all, the Greek word apokryphos, from which our term apocryphal comes from, means hidden or secret or even obscure. Now, obscure may have kind of a negative connotation to it, but as we'll see, that was part of the question with the Apocryphal Gospels, is were they hidden in secret in a good way or were they hidden in secret in a bad way? And depending on who was talking about them, they had different opinions. And as used by early Christian writers then, the word describes books which, in a negative sense, usually. So the word describes books which, as Simon Gathercole says, exercised undue allure, or which trespassed on the contents of the Bible by supplementing or replacing the same material or the ground or the subject matter that it covered. So Irenaeus, for example, speaks of his opponents as, quote, as having an unspeakable number of apocryphal and spurious writings, which they themselves have forged to bewilder the minds of foolish men and of such as are ignorant of the scriptures of truth. Let me see, I think I have this quote on here for you. Here's this quote. So this gives you kind of the negative connotation of this term apocryphal as Irenaeus would use it. He means it clearly in a negative sense. It's right alongside spurious writings, okay? And he wants his writers to think, no, these things are dangerous, they're bad, and they're not helpful, all right? And you can see that sense already in the idea of obscure in the meaning apocrypha. Now, I need to say here before we go further, we're not talking about the Old Testament apocrypha here, okay? This is an easy confusion to make, to think that the Apocryphal Gospels have something to do with the Old Testament Apocrypha that Dr. Mead talked about yesterday. Although the same term is used, there's really quite a bit different history behind these two categories, so don't confuse those two. Some of you are thinking, I wasn't confusing those two. Now that you brought it up, I am, so thanks for that. Okay. If you want a little bit more on this, in the book we have a definition of the Apocrypha, and we try to sort some of this out for you. But just get the Old Testament out of your mind, okay, with apologies to Derek. They are early writings about Jesus that are not in the New Testament. That's probably the simplest definition to give you right off the bat, okay? There's no agreed upon list of these. There's no agreed upon list in the ancient world. There's no agreed list upon today. If you pick up different collections of the Apocryphal Gospels, I have this one by Simon Gathercole that I'll recommend to you at the end. He includes some stuff that other collections don't today because there's no agreed list, okay? It's a little bit of a hodgepodge category, as I'll show you in a minute, okay? But one thing I want to say before we go on is to say the term apocryphal is not just one that the Christian critics like Irenaeus of these Gospels use for them. They are also terms that sometimes these Gospels use for themselves. Does this make sense? So it's not just like a negative term that Irenaeus uses for them. He's not being unfair in calling them this because at least in several prominent cases, they describe themselves this way. So here's the start of two well-known apocryphal Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas. And the Gospel of Thomas begins by saying, these are the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. And then it goes on to give a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus. But do you see the way that they're introduced? They are introduced as hidden or secret sayings. Okay? And the same thing is true in the Gospel of Judas. It's supposedly the secret message of the revelation which Jesus spoke to Judas Iscariot. Of course, that's quite a surprising one, isn't it? That gets your attention right away. So keep in mind that the term could be used by these books, by the authors of these writings themselves, okay? And so this means that it was not just Christians who tarred these books with the term apocryphal. Rather, at least in some of these books, they identify themselves as either hidden, and again, you might think of it in terms of esoteric. They were meant for sort of insiders or for an elite few, okay? And I stress this because the term itself, apocryphal or hidden, implies a contrast, doesn't it? As soon as you hear hidden, you think, well, then there's other things that are not hidden. And in Greek, the opposite of being apocryphal is to be visible or to be public accessible. So for Greek students, apokryphos is your Greek term for hidden. Phoneros, apparent or visible or obvious, would be your contrast. So to call a gospel apocryphal, as in the Gospel of Thomas, is to imply that there are other gospels that are plain or clear, not esoteric, not obscure. Now, that may not seem like much after 2,000 years where the canonical Gospels have influenced Western culture and are so familiar to us. But I think it's important to stress this distinction because Christians did not call the four canonical Gospels apocryphal. Why? Because however hard the Gospels may be sometimes to understand, at certain points you've surely read the Gospels at times and thought, what is Jesus talking about here? Right? But despite some of the confusing parts in the Gospels as a whole were not hidden, and they were not intended for just the extra clever, or the super special, or just insiders. They were intended for all. So think about the contrast between the way these two Gospels start, the hidden sayings, and then many of the sayings in both these Gospels are very enigmatic and hard to understand. Contrast that with the Gospel of Matthew that culminates with the good news and the proclamation that all authority in heaven and earth has been given to Jesus. Why? So that they can go out and make disciples of the elite, the select few, the privileged, no, but to all nations, and make disciples of them, teaching them what? To obey all the really hard to understand stuff. To obey all that he has commanded his disciples. It's very clear from the end of Matthew's gospel that this story about Jesus is for everyone to hear, and that all peoples are called to discipleship and to obedience to Jesus. And so whatever things may be hard to understand in the Gospels, they nevertheless are meant to be apparent, visible, phoneros, publicly accessible. And that's in contrast to many of these apocryphal Gospels which are meant to be hidden. So to clarify a little bit further on exactly what is an apocryphal gospel, I don't know if you have this game here. Do you have bingo? Yes. Okay. I thought we'd just play a little bingo game of how to decide what the apocryphal gospels are to help you see that not every feature of every apocryphal gospel applies to all of them. Okay, so first you might ask the question, are all the apocryphal gospels in a narrative form? Are they a story? And the answer is no. So no bingo yet. All right. They're not all stories. The Gospel of Thomas famously is 114 sayings. There's no narrative at all. It's one of the most striking features of that gospel. There's no story to it. There's no narrative. It's just saying after saying after saying. There's no narrative structure. Now, Matthew's gospel is famously structured around 5 long teaching sections of Jesus. Think of the Sermon on the Mount, for example, right? But sandwiched in between those, or maybe it's the other way around, there's narrative structure to the story. And so it progresses. The story has tension to it, where if you read it correctly, now sometimes it's lost on us today because we're so familiar, but it has a tension to it. You're meant to read the story and think, how is this story going to resolve? What's going to happen? I often tell my students when I teach the Gospels, I say, if you get to the crucifixion and you can't figure out why people want to kill Jesus, you got to start over. Because all the chapters before that are leading up to that point and trying to help you see, why did he make people so mad? Why did he upset people so much? There's a story, there's a narrative structure to it, but not all of our Apocryphal Gospels are narrative. Some are, but not all are. Are they all collections of saying then? Well, no, they're not that either. Some are narratives, some are collections of sayings. Now, at least for our purposes today, they are all fairly early. They're at least before the year 500. Again, this is somewhat arbitrary, so this is one of those features of the Apocryphal Gospels. We sort of just have to draw a line somewhere. Next, were they all suppressed? Were they all suppressed? No, they were not. We've just read a pretty serious criticism from Irenaeus. So we have numerous examples of early Christian writers critiquing these, and sometimes very severely and in harsh language, but that doesn't mean you should think that they were always suppressed. In fact, some of these were quite popular even among Christians. The infancy narrative, for example, of James was very popular, and we get lots of our, let's call them, ideas about the birth of Jesus from that. If you've ever heard the idea that Jesus was born in a cave, for example, that comes from that Apocryphal Gospel. The perpetual virginity of Mary, for example, you can find at least in initial form there as well. So some ideas that later developed further among Christians are found in these Gospels. So they're not all suppressed. We, of course, get a free space. They are all, however, not in the New Testament. That is one feature that ties them all together. They're not all complete. Many of them are fragmentary. You've got a couple pictures on my slides here. This is a fragment of one of these Gospels that was just published a few years ago, one I actually worked on as a graduate student. You saw it on the first slide. That's the whole, pretty much the whole thing here. I'll go back to it so you can see it. That's pretty much the whole thing. It actually has some material from Matthew's Gospel and some from the Gospel of Thomas, which is why it's pretty interesting, but all on the theme of worrying. But that's the whole thing right there. Okay. So keep in mind, some of these are complete, like the Gospel of Thomas. We do now have a complete copy, but in many cases they are only fragmentary. Do they all call themselves gospel? No, they really don't. The Gospel of Thomas clearly does. The Gospel of Judas does. Those have the title Gospel of, just like we have with our canonical Gospels, but many of them do not have this exact title, so it's a little bit of a misnomer. However, they all get under this category of Apocryphal Gospel because, lastly, they do all have to do with Jesus. Okay? As you can see from these 3 things, they're early, they're not in the New Testament, and they're about Jesus. And you're thinking, that's a pretty big category, isn't it? And you're exactly right. Okay? And so let me help you just a little bit more by thinking about some of the types that we try to group these in, these sort of subcategories to help give you some hooks to hang your hat on about what we're talking about. You can think of maybe 4 categories, and I'll add a 5th just for fun. Some of these are stories about Jesus' birth or his childhood, or in some cases even Mary's birth and her childhood. So the proto-evangelion of James, that tells about Mary's birth, and then goes into more detail about Jesus' birth. Something like the infancy Gospel of Thomas answers questions about Jesus' childhood. We'll come back to that in a second. All right. Then we have Gospels that you could put under the category, say, ministry Gospels or sayings Gospels. They touch on Jesus' ministry. They maybe don't mention his birth or his death and resurrection, but they have his teaching. So the Gospel of Thomas would fit in this category where it's a collection of sayings of Jesus. And then we could categorize at the end of Jesus' story, we could call them Passion Gospels. These expand on Jesus' trial and crucifixion. So something like the Gospel of Peter would fit in this case. And then lastly, our 4th category would be post-resurrection Gospels. These expand on what Jesus taught in the 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. So something like the Gospel of Mary we could put here. Again, these are attempts to categorize them. None of these categories are perfect. Some of these you could fit in multiple categories. It's not neat and tidy, but just to give you some ways to think about them. And then the last one is forgeries. These are modern fakes. If any of you heard about the Gospel of Jesus' wife a number of years ago, this turned out to be a modern fake. All right, so people are still interested in writing stuff about Jesus. He is very popular, as it turns out. Here's some other ones just to give you a list of some others that maybe you've heard of or not heard of, to give you a sense. This is by no means exhaustive, as not meant to be. So just to give you some sense of what we're talking about in these. Now, let's ask the question that often comes up when we think about the Apocryphal Gospels, and that is, why were they written? And why were they read? Why did people even do this? And I want to give you 4 reasons. You could probably expand on this or tweak this on your own as you read them and think about them. But the first one, and maybe the biggest one, I think, is curiosity. And you could put entertainment along with that. Now you're thinking, what? Surely you have been curious about some things about Jesus that are not in the Bible. You're thinking, no. I only care about what's in the canonical Gospels. Really? Because the canonical Gospels themselves raise some questions you might answer. For instance, have you ever wondered, how did Mary and Joseph meet? There's no backstory. I mean, you get the genealogy, yes, but don't you want to know, did they meet in college? Did they meet, what? Was it love at first sight? Well, these Apocryphal Gospels fill in some of those details. So the Proto-Evangelion of James tells the story of Mary tells about her birth, who her parents were, gives you all her backstory, tells us that she grew up in the temple where she's cared for like a dove and fed by angels. That's pretty remarkable. And then at 12, God reveals to Zechariah, the priest, that this girl who's now 12 and they're not quite sure what to do with her anymore at the temple, God reveals to Zechariah in the temple that she needs to marry a widower. Well, how are you going to decide which one? He says, go out and have all the widowers come together. They all bring their staff, and then they're going to take the staffs into the temple, and God's going to give them a sign as to which staff belongs to which person, and that's how they're going to know what to marry. Sure enough, they bring out the staffs, they hand them back to the different guys, and nothing happens until they hand Joseph his staff, and a dove comes out of the staff and perches on his head. There you go. That's how they met. All right. Now, there's all sorts of things that are going on here about Mary. You've got already sort of a rise in Mariology at this point that's probably reflected in this text. But at a baseline, the Proto-Evangelion of James is answering a question, how did they meet? Which is a legitimate question to ask when you've read the canonical Gospels. And they're thinking, well, I want to know more about Mary and Joseph. They must have been, important, significant. They seem important. Or how about this? What did people think of Mary's pregnancy? What do people think of Mary's pregnancy? She's pregnant for 9 months. At some point, she starts to show, I presume. The Proto-Evangelion of James, again, answers this question for us. So here's Annas, who says, one of the priests, he says, Joseph, why have you not appeared in our assembly? He's essentially saying, Joseph, you haven't been at church in a while. What's up? Because at this point in the story, Joseph knows she's pregnant, and he's like, I don't know what to do. Joseph says, I'm tired from traveling and I've taken a day to rest, right? I've been busy at work. I can't make it to church on Sunday, right? This is classic. Annas turned aside and saw Mary obviously pregnant, and he rushes away to the high priest to tell them about it. And then there's a whole process by which they go through to see if they're guilty or innocent, and sure enough, it turns out both Mary and Joseph are innocent, right? But it's filling in a gap in the story. What did people think of Mary's pregnancy? At one point, the Proto-Evangelion tells us about how Joseph decided to not divorce her, and he's torn because he says, well, if I don't divorce her, people are going to think that, I'm wicked, that I've done something wrong. But if I do divorce her, then what happens to this child? What if it's really a miracle baby? Then what happens, right? So he's really torn, and that's why he decides to divorce her and put her away in secret, right? Which is what Matthew tells us. So again, it's giving us some of the backstory, trying to fill in details that I'm sure if you've really thought about it, you have been curious about. Take another one. What had the 2 crucified criminals done? In Luke's account, we get the most details about these 2. Remember, one confesses miraculously about him, but the other is critical of Jesus. These 2 figures show the reactions to Jesus that happened in his own life from the very cross, and of course, that still happen today, right? There's a dramatic choice to be made about Jesus, and these 2 figures represent the only 2 choices you can make. But what have they done? The narrative of Joseph and Arimathea fills in the gaps. The first one, it's the guy who curses Jesus, whose name was Gestus, we get his name, so there's a gap that's filled in, would murder travelers by putting them to the sword, and others he stripped naked. He hung women upside down by their ankles, and I'm leaving out the worst part here with the ... He never acknowledged God or followed the law and was violent from his earliest days in activities like these. He's a real bad guy. So the story is setting you up to not feel sorry for him, right? When he's crucified. The other guy actually is more of like a Robin Hood figure. He's still not liked, but you can tell he's going to be the guy that turns out to do the right thing. All right. So these are the kinds of things. If you've read the Gospels, you can wonder about these characters that you don't learn much about. I say the best one for last. I've gone a little bit out of order here, but this has got to be the big one. Surely you have wondered this. What was Jesus like as a child? I always wondered, what was it like to be his parent? When I was younger, I would always think, what was it like to be his sibling? Now that I'm a parent, I think, what was it like to parent him? Was he really easy to parent? Because he never sinned? Or were his parents just like always confused by him? Like, what do we do with this kid? Right? I always think, sometimes people think like, oh, everybody must have just thought, Jesus, this is me, okay? This is totally, you can take this or leave this. This is not from the Bible. I think people just thought he was weird. Because they had no category for it. For a human being who never sins. I think they must have just thought, what do we do with this kid? Okay, well, the infancy Gospel of Thomas tells a bunch of stories to sort of fill in the gaps. And in particular, it leaves off right at age 12, which is where Luke tells us a story about Jesus as a 12-year-old, right? And it fills in the gap from him at age 5, age 8, and age 12. So it kind of takes stops along the way to give us a sense. You might even wonder, what was it like to be Jesus' teacher? Well, if you want to know, the infancy Gospel of Thomas tells about him going to school. And not surprisingly, he schools his teacher. His teacher's like, his teacher sees the way he's behaving and tells his dad, hey, you need to get this kid in school. So he takes him to school and he starts to teach him the alphabet. And Jesus starts, he starts with alpha, and Jesus says back to him, do you really know what alpha is? And he just goes from there. This is the one where famously he takes clay and turns them into birds. Okay. Here's how it begins. It says, this is the beginning of the infancy Gospel of Thomas. I, Thomas the Israelite, have considered it my duty to recount to all the Gentile brethren the deeds of our Lord Jesus, who was born in our land of Bethlehem, the village of Nazareth. This is how it all began, right? He's going to take us back. Let's see if I can give you, I'm going to try not to just read too much from these. But here's what I like. When he was 8 years old, when Jesus was about 8 years old, his father, who was a carpenter, was working on some plows and yokes. He took a pallet from a rich man to extend it considerably and make it serviceable. One side was shorter than the other, and not the right length. Joseph was worried and did not know what to do. When the child came up to him, he said, put down the 2 planks of wood, Jesus said, and square them up on your side. Joseph did as Jesus had told him. The boy stood on the other side and held the short plank. He stretched it, making it the same length as the other plank. Don't worry, now you can make it the way you want it, he said to his father. Joseph hugged him and kissed him. I'm so blessed to have been given such a child by God, he said. You see, he's solving problems for his dad. Now, before you're laughing, it's totally appropriate to laugh, but don't you see Jesus doing some things like this when the disciples can't catch fish? And he says, well, try the other side. And you're thinking, okay, really? The water is so different 4 feet away, right? He seems to solve problems for people, doesn't he? Now, of course, there's more of a point in the canonical Gospels. But again, one reason, I think it's a big reason, why the Apocryphal Gospels were written is to satisfy curiosity and in some cases to entertain. Now, there's more than that, but just not less. Okay? So often the details that are in them are there because they're not talked about in the canonical Gospels. A second reason for their writing, I think, is harmonization. To try to put the 4 Gospels together. And there were several ways this could be done. 2 of the most famous examples of attempts to do this, the first one is Tatian's, what is known as Tatian's diatessaron. Diatessaron is a word that means through the 4. And we still have these today. We call them gospel harmonies. You can still buy them. And Tatian is the first person we know to really try to do this. Unfortunately, it only exists in like some Arabic and Latin translations. We can't get back to his original text, but we do have a commentary by an early Syriac church father. So we think we can know the order and how he at least put the 4 Gospels together in the order, even if we can't always know the exact details. So just to give you a little taste of it, here's how the diatessaron starts. Now you might ask yourself, if you were going to harmonize the Gospels, where would you start? What pieces would you put together and in what order? Tatian starts with John 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word. He says, well, John goes all the way back, so I'm going to start all the way back. Then he turns to Luke and gives John's birth account with the birth of John the Baptist and the Annunciation to Mary, then gives the birth account from Matthew, then gives the birth account and the shepherds from Luke. Now, before you criticize Tatian too much, I bet at Christmas time you do something similar at your church. If you put out a nativity, I can promise you your nativity is a harmonized version of the gospel accounts of Jesus' birth. You've put Matthew and Luke together, so much so you don't realize you're even doing it. When I tell my students which things are in which Gospels and which things aren't, they're always surprised to find that the Star of Bethlehem is not in Luke at all. Right? That the shepherds are not in Matthew at all, you say. But of course they are. I've seen the nativity. That's because you've harmonized them. All right, so some of these Apocryphal Gospels are attempts to harmonize them. The other end of the spectrum, where Tatian was trying to weave them together into one narrative, the other form of this was Marcion's Gospel. Now, Marcion is sort of the arch-heretic of the 2nd century. Marcion, as you may remember or may know, really did not like the Old Testament and its God. And so he had a much smaller canon. And when it came to the Gospels, he only used Luke's Gospel, and he edited out the parts he didn't like. So he really edits out the whole birth narrative itself. But you can see why when it comes to Irenaeus, Irenaeus feels the need not just to say we have 4 Gospels, but only 4. It's both of those pieces that matter for Irenaeus. It's not enough just to say we don't have 1. You got to say we have 4 and only 4. Because in his time there were people who accepted more, and there were people like Marcion who wanted to accept less. So we needed that. A third reason is for theological instruction. One of the things to know about the Apocryphal Gospels is they're not all heretical. Okay? So when Irenaeus is talking about them, he certainly has them in that category, but some of them, like the Epistle of the Apostles or the Epistola Apostolorum, is really quite orthodox. Here's part of it. It says, "This know we, that our Lord and Redeemer Jesus Christ is God, the Son of God, who was sent of God, the Lord of the whole world, the maker and creator of it, who is named by all names and high above all powers, Lord of lords, King of kings, ruler of rulers." Some of these Apocryphal Gospels are actually designed to reinforce early Christian orthodoxy, things that we would argue are already taught in the Scriptures themselves, right? So theological instruction, it's not always negative or heretical. However, sometimes it certainly is, okay? Sometimes it certainly is. So sometimes these Apocryphal Gospels are almost certainly written not to reinforce Christian orthodoxy, but to subvert the canonical Gospels, okay? And this is where they get their negative reputation, certainly among Christians, and they deserve it, okay? I can just say it. So, for example, the Gospel of Judas says this, let's see, page 35. "If any of you is strong enough," Jesus talking to the disciples, "if any of you is strong enough among humans to bring out the perfect humanity, stand up and face me." That sounds a little different than the Jesus in the Gospels. Sounds like he wants to fight him. All of them said, "We're strong enough." Okay, now that does sound like the Gospels, doesn't it? Because often the disciples are like, "Oh yeah, we're great. We're ready for this." Okay. But then look what happens. Their spirits weren't brave enough to stand before him, except Judas Iscariot? That's surprising. Okay? That's surprising. And then Judas goes on to say to him, "I know who you are." Now, who does that sound like in the canonical Gospels? Doesn't that sound like Peter and his confession? So you can see how the Gospel of Judas is saying, you know that story from Matthew. I'm going to subvert it by telling a very similar one. But now, guess what? It's Judas who says, "I know who you are and where you've come from." Now, he goes on to say, "You have come from the immortal aeon of Barbelo." So, again, quite different, okay? But you can see how the Gospel of Judas, not only in its title, but in its content, is very much trying to subvert the canonical Gospels, okay? So there's a range of reasons as to why these things are written. For in some cases, they seem to be innocent attempts to satisfy curiosity. In some cases, they're an attempt to harmonize the 4 Gospels. In some cases, they're trying to instruct Christians in what seem to be fairly orthodox ways. In other times, it's much more negative in a case like this, where they seem to be very intentionally subverting one or more of the canonical Gospels. So that brings us to the question then, why aren't they in the Bible? Well, you're already getting a taste for why they aren't in the Bible, okay? And we go back to Helmut Custer, who says, the only reason is dogmatic prejudice. And I want to suggest that's not the case. So let me give you several reasons. Some of these, I don't have time to go into all these. In fact, I'm going to focus just on one for the sake of time, okay? Why aren't these canonical Gospels, or non-canonical Gospels in the Bible? First of all, date and authorship. Now, these two really go together. I should have put them together, okay? You remember from Mario's talk last night, he said something very important that I want to pick up on. He said, sometimes we make the wrong assumption that earlier is always better. That earlier is always better or more true or something like this, okay? Now, in a sense, this can be true with the Gospels, but only if you keep the question of date tied to the question of, I think, of authorship. What do I mean? You cannot simply say that earlier is better and later is worse because you have 4 Gospels in your Bible. One of them has to be earlier than the other 3. Are you with me? One of them has to be the latest one. So the fact that John is later than Mark does not mean, well, it's bad then. Do you see the problem? So at some point, if you're just saying, well, date, earlier is better and later is worse, well, if you actually apply that to our 4 Gospels, that's going to be a problem for you. So you can't just say, at least in that form, earlier better, later worse. You've got to tie it to what the early church tied it to, and that is the question of authorship. The reason the dating mattered for the early church, and I'm not suggesting they did, detailed dating the way we do today, but the reason dating mattered for the question of canon is because the question of authorship mattered. Let me give you a question that's an example that's not an apocryphal gospel, but is still one of these sort of books that sometimes people think maybe it should have been in the Bible, or it was kept out accidentally or something. The Shepherd of Hermas was a 2nd century writing that was very popular among early Christians. But early Christians rejected it because they said, we know when it's been written. And it's been written in our own day, by which they meant the 2nd century. You say, well, what's wrong with the 2nd century? Well, nothing intrinsically, except that one group of people had all died by then. Which group of people was that? The apostles. You'll notice when you read the book of Acts that Judas gets replaced, and then after more apostles start dying in Acts, they do not get replaced. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. Right? The early church recognized that you could not replace the apostles. And once the apostles start dying, the question is, where are we going to find their authority if they are dead? And the answer is, in their writings. So the question of date mattered because the question of authorship mattered to them. They believed that these 4 Gospels were written by the apostles or their close associates, and these apocryphal Gospels, despite their names, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas, were not actually written by the apostles or their close associates. They had been written too late to be written by those people. It's very interesting, for example, the Gospel of Mark is so consistently called the Gospel of Mark. Right? I don't know if you've ever thought about this. Who is Mark? You can say like a couple things about him off the top of your head? Because we know he's not like an important figure in the Gospels, is he? Why would the early church name a gospel after him? Because they believed that Mark was giving the written account of who's preaching? The Apostle Peter, right? So that apostolic connection between Mark and Peter was crucial. They believed Mark wrote the gospel, but they believed behind it stood the authority of Peter and his preaching of the gospel in Rome, right? Now, I'm going to go through 4 and 5 really quickly here for the sake of time because we're coming up here on time. John can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think any of these apocryphal gospels are ever in a canon list, right? He's giving me the official no. Okay, he's the expert on the canon list. And at least in Greek manuscripts, now in other languages it gets a little bit dicey or a little more complicated, but at least in Greek manuscripts, none of these apocryphal gospels are ever included alongside our canonical gospels. Okay? So from those 2 things we have confirmation that early Christians did not think of any of these apocryphal gospels as canonical, ever. Okay? There's maybe one exception that sort of proves the rule. But I want to focus just briefly here as we close on the question of contents. And this actually picks up from the previous talk in this question of their self-authentication. I said at the beginning that you can just read the apocryphal gospels for yourself and you will know the difference. You will not have any doubts because the contents are so different. And here I want to draw from an argument from Simon Gathercole, whose book I'll recommend at the end here. But he draws our attention to 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5, where Paul talks about the gospel he has received and then handed on. And he says this, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ, that's the word for Messiah, died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12, and he goes on from there. And from this, Simon Gathercole draws 3 things that he says distinguish the canonical Gospels from the non-canonical ones. He says what distinguishes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that they faithfully represent Jesus' messiahship, his saving death and resurrection, and his fulfillment of Scripture. And this stands in sharp contrast to the apocryphal Gospels, which either represent such teaching incompletely, ignore it, or, in some cases we saw with the Gospel of Judas, actively reject it. So I want to just give you a couple examples from the Gospel of Thomas as we close to show you this in practice. I'm going to use Thomas because it's one of the most famous ones, and I think you can see it in a couple places. First of all, the question of the Messiah. Is Jesus the Messiah? Look at what the Gospel of Thomas has Jesus saying in its 13th saying. Jesus said to his disciples, if you were to compare me to someone, who would you say I'm like? Again, we've heard this before, haven't we? This is very much like the Gospel of Judas, which is like the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, Peter's confession of Jesus. So he's asking the question, who do men say that I am? That's the form you know it in. Now, what does Simon Peter say to him? You are the Christ, if you know the canonical Gospels. But what does he say in the Gospel of Thomas? You're just like an angel. I suppose that's nice. It seems like a compliment, I don't know. But it's different than Messiah, isn't it? What is Matthew? Matthew said to him, you're like a wise philosopher. Gathercole actually takes this as a way that the Gospel of Thomas is pitting itself against the written Gospel of Matthew at this point. And saying, hey, you've read Matthew's Gospel, he's just a wise philosopher there. I'm giving you the secret, right? The Gospel of Thomas is the secret wisdom. Thomas, who's the key character in the Gospel of Thomas, why it's named after him, said to him, teacher, I'm completely unable to say whom you're like. You see that? That's that secret element, that apocryphal element, that enigmatic element that you often find here. We don't even know what he's like. See how different that is from the canonical Gospels? The major theme in the canonical Gospels is who Jesus is. The whole point is for you to see who he is, not to leave you at the end going, I'm completely unable to say what you're like. Now, in a sense, we would say, of course, he's unique, yes? But hopefully by the end of the canonical Gospels, you can say a lot of things about who he is. And that, of course, is the point. So the Gospel of Thomas fails on this first test. Does it teach that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, which is what the Gospel contains, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15? How about his death and resurrection? There isn't one in Thomas. How can you have a gospel with no death and resurrection? You can't. That's what the gospel is. Here's how the Gospel of Thomas famously ends. No death, no resurrection, no salvation for sin. I guess a salvation of a kind. Simon Peter said to them, Mary should leave us because women aren't worthy of life. Jesus says, no, it's okay, don't worry. I'm able to make her a man so that she may become a living spirit too. She's equal to you, men, because every woman who makes herself manly will enter the kingdom of heaven. That just scrambles everybody, doesn't it? I mean, nobody today likes that. Nobody. It doesn't matter where you are in the question of transgenderism. Nobody's happy with that. All right, it fails the death and resurrection test. I realize I'm going through these quickly, but lastly, how about the fulfillment of Scripture? One of the things that is so striking about the canonical Gospels is how much they are at pains to show you that Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament promises. Just over and over and over again, they're either quoting from the Old Testament or alluding to it to show you the way that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament. That's that element we saw in 1 Corinthians 15. Twice Paul says, according to the Scriptures. The gospel in our Bibles is not a dramatic right turn from the Old Testament. It's the culmination of it, but not in the Gospel of Thomas. His disciples said to him, 24 prophets have spoken in Israel, and they all spoke of you. Now, thanks to John, I don't need to explain what 24 means, right? That's that way of numbering the Old Testament books that we saw earlier among Jewish writers. 24 prophets have spoken in Israel, and they all spoke of you. That sounds like our canonical Gospels, and Jesus should then go on to say, yes, you got it. He says to them, you've ignored the living one right in front of you, and you've talked about those who are dead. See the contrast? Does Jesus ever do that? He says he's the fulfillment of the Old Testament Scriptures. To be sure, he's the culmination and the high point, right? But he's not in contrast to it. He doesn't disparage what comes before. He actually puts himself in the line of the prophets and just says he's the greatest of all of them, but does not pit himself against the Old Testament prophets like the Gospel of Thomas. So as we close, I want you to just hopefully give you a little sense of why we have our 4 canonical Gospels. Because we believe as Christians, they have the apostles' authority behind them. These are, if I can call them this, they are the authorized biographies of Jesus for the church. Right? Whatever interesting things the Apocryphal Gospels may tell us about, and they do tell us some very interesting things, we do not preach and teach from them. We do not base our life on them. Why? Because they do not come with God's own authority, right? These 4 Gospels, our 4 Gospels, tell us the story of Jesus' life, his ministry, his death, and resurrection. And how that is a story not just for the elite, not just for the insiders or those who can figure out the esoteric sayings, but for all nations. Last, I'll just close with some recommended resources. If this has piqued your interest and you want to know more, the best edition I would recommend is by Simon Gathercole in the Penguin Classics series. It's just come out a few years ago. It has a great introduction to the Apocryphal Gospels and an introduction to each one of them as well. Very good, easy to read translation. Marcus Bachmuel's book, The Ancient Apocryphal Gospels, is much more introduction about them. And then he's written an article for us at the Text Canon Institute that I put on our homepage today. So if you just go to textandcanon.org, you'll say, I don't want to read another book. I'm taking your class. Go read his article, and that'll be good. Lastly, if you want to know more about the canonical Gospels themselves and why we have these four and how they were recognized, Chuck Hill's book, Who Chose the Gospels, is a great one. Peter Williams' Can We Trust the Gospels is great on the historical reliability of the Gospels, and I checked before, it is in Dutch now. I don't think Marcel published it, though, sadly, no. And then the one in the middle is actually not out yet. You say, why are you recommending a book you haven't read yet? Well, this is by Simon Gathercole, making the argument in much more detail that I've just given to you, how the contents of these Gospels clearly distinguish the canonical ones from the non-canonical ones. This is a shortened version of a much bigger book that he wrote a few years ago that I've read. This is probably the one you want to read. It's much more accessible, especially if you are a pastor. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention.